As you'll see, this series in Ecclesiastes will be similar to the series we did on James last year in that wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, Psalms, and James is, like we talked about, in a lot of ways, sort of mirroring wisdom literature, tends to jump around in subjects and not really follow a linear line of thought. Linear line, that's redundant. A line of thought doesn't follow linear thought like Paul's letters do, for instance. So we're not going to move verse by verse through the book like we do sometimes, but we're going to look at sections that talk about the same kind of idea, the same topic, even though they're not sequential in the book. You'll see that today a bit. But first, totally unsurprisingly, I did a poor job explaining what I meant, at least in totem, in the last Ecclesiastes sermon. There were good questions given to me afterward by people that I trust and respect and admire. And a lot of the questions were similar, which tells me that I didn't answer those questions, or I did a poor job of explaining what I was trying to explain. So let me spend the first part here sort of seeking to clarify what we've said so far from the book of Ecclesiastes just quickly. Okay, I want to make these statements simple and clear. Firstly, all is not meaningless, but all is hevel. Right? We have those translation, everything is meaningless, meaningless, everything's meaningless, or vanity, vanity, in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And we want to make it clear that those words really aren't great. They're about the best we can do in English. But the word there is hevel, which is a picture word meaning vapor. And so when he says all is hevel, he's not saying all is meaningless. In fact, he goes on in Ecclesiastes to talk about things that are meaningful. We talked about 1 Corinthians 10:31 last time, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God, and that eating or drinking there representing the sort of just ordinary life, that everything we do, even in our ordinary lives, is meant to do to the glory of God, and therefore everything is meaningful. So all is not meaningless, but all is vapor, meaning all is temporary and fleeting, and we've spent even more time focusing on the meaning that hevel has, that it is unable to be controlled, that you can't reach out and grab vapor and make it do what you want it to do, that life is uncontrollable, that from our perspective and our vantage point as creatures and not the creator, that we don't have utter control, even though we desperately want it. Secondly, your life will have no surplus. Your life will have no surplus. And we looked at last time the argument made here, the picture given here by the writer of Ecclesiastes, or by the preacher Kohelet. And he uses the sun and the rivers and the wind as an example of this reality, saying the sun rises and then sets, and then it rises again the next day, not having extra because of the work it did on the day previous. That there is no surplus, there is no profit from the sun's labor. That it just rises to the same exact thing it did the day before. That there is no surplus to the water. That the rivers aren't flowing to the ocean so that the ocean one day will be full. In fact, the ocean is not more full today than it was yesterday, even though the rivers all flowed into it today. That the efforts of the river are not for the end of surplus, but just for the efforts themselves. And that the wind blows from the north to the south, and then all it does is go back to the north and go again. That the creation itself is not making all of its efforts and all of its toil for the purpose of surplus, for the purpose of profits, but for the purpose of the efforts themselves, for the purpose of the toil itself. The river flows because it's made to flow. The sun rises because it has been made and assigned by its creator the task of rising, and so whether or not it will profit by doing so, it simply does so. And the wind is no different. The river isn't anxiously striving to make sure it gets to the ocean on time, or in efforts to fill the ocean up. Why would it be anxious? There will be no surplus. It will do it again tomorrow, right? Anxious striving has no place here in the life of the Christian. Anxious striving has no place here. Whether it comes to your joy or your toil or your very salvation, you find your rest entirely in God. And then thirdly, and perhaps the one that I was least clear on, the point of your life isn't gain or profit. The point of your life isn't gain or profit. Now, all these are kind of building on each other. Okay, so here's what I want to say. It's a very good thing to work hard. It's a good thing to make profit. But the profit isn't the point. The gain isn't the point. It's the work itself that's the point, right? So the point of the river flowing isn't to fill up the ocean. The point of the river flowing is to flow. The point of the sun rising isn't to give once and for all light so it doesn't have to do it anymore. So it can work more easily tomorrow. Right? The sun isn't saying, really when I get 60 or 70, I'll really be able to relax. The point of the sun rising is that the sun is meant to rise. The point of your efforts and your toil isn't profit. Profit is a possible result. In fact, a likely one if you're working hard. But it might not be the result. Loss might be the result. But there's good news here from Kohelet. That even if profit isn't the result, profit wasn't the goal. The real goal is the task itself that God has assigned to you. Right? It's a product of the sun rising that plants grow. But the sun is faithful and content in his normal work of rising, whether or not the plants grow or die. The task of the sun is not to make the plants grow. The task of the sun is to shine. And so therefore, whether the plants grow or the plants die, the sun wasn't less faithful or less effective or less contented in his daily assignment. His joy is in rising, not in just the result of that rising. It's a product of the river flowing that fish are able to live. But the river doesn't flow so that fish can live. In fact, sometimes fish die. It flows because God has told it to, and it is contenting itself in its daily task. It is not sinful to work to make a profit, but the profit is the possible result of the task. So your joy and contentment should be more in the task itself than in the profit, which may or may not result. Profit may or may not result from all your toil. Surplus may or may not result. So your joy should not be in the profit or in the surplus that may or may not result. Your joy as the river, as the sun, as the wind should be contenting yourself in the task. You weren't made for gain. You weren't made for surplus. You were made for the task that God has assigned you. And all of the possible results are left to him. My task as a minister is an easy example of this, right? I work and I pray hard for growth here at Ohatchee. Spiritual growth primarily is what I work and pray for. Spiritual growth first. Spiritual growth of those of you who are the sheep. But also numerical growth. I pray for us to grow numerically also. But I don't have control over either one of those types of growth. I don't have control over any of that. If I am faithful to the task that I've been given, I am not less faithful or less pleasing to God if no one grows or if more people leave than come. I am to be contented, not in numerical growth or even in spiritual growth, but being faithful to the task that God has assigned to me. So that if no one grows and no one comes and more people leave, I am contented in the task that God has given me, and I'm faithful, and my joy is in that faithfulness. Well, Renee, if you do all that, if you work hard and pray hard, then they'll come and they'll grow. Maybe, but really? Tell that to Noah, who preached for 100 years and saved nobody extra. Tell that to Jeremiah, whom the whole country hated, despite his preaching the truth. There's a modern viewpoint in the church, it's a little side note, that we call pragmatism, which says if you do things a certain way, then you'll grow. Maybe. But maybe not. But my task as a minister is not growth, actually. My task is planting and then seeing if God grows it. Praying, working, and seeing if God grows it. Seeing if God grows you. So, it is not sinful to make a profit. It is good. It's good to work hard. But your joy and contentment should be more in the work than in the profit, which may or may not result. You are to be but a sun rising, a river flowing, a wind blowing, and God is in control of the results, right? Your task is no different than mine, just because I'm a minister and your task is officially less churchy, even though there is no secular task. You are in control of being faithful to the assignment that God has given you today. You have no control over what you get from that work, as much as you want to convince yourself that you do. Now, this isn't important side note, this isn't a license to be lazy, right? A license for apathy. In fact, it's almost the opposite. The river flows vehemently, right? The sun rises in all of its hot, burning power and fervor. The wind blows fervently. The Christian should be the hardest worker in his office because he works hard for very different reasons than other people work hard. And he finds motivation that no one else can find. It isn't motivation for laziness, but it's motivation for peace. And it's a motivation to not be anxious. Rest in the reality that God is the only one that has control. Not you, not your enemy, not the devil. Right? It seems positive to say that your enemy doesn't have control and the devil doesn't have control. It seems negative to say, but you don't have control either. But actually, Kohelet is saying that's a positive too. God has given you a task. And he's given you a task this morning, and he'll give you one this afternoon and this evening, and your task is to be faithful to that thing. And let him handle the rest. Content yourself in the task given. If the task is to help the company profit, then that's the task. But the task, really, in itself, is the end, not just the means to profit. Your faithfulness, your joy, lies not in the profit, but in the contented work. Look at these passages. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, 24 through 26. Kohelet says, "There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or have enjoyment?" Chapter 5, verse 18. "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot." Chapter 8, verse 15. "I commend joy, for man has no good thing under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun." It's wonderful how directly that parallels to 1 Corinthians 10:31. What Paul may be having these passages in mind when he said, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. Eating and drinking is this symbol of ordinariness. Just ordinariness, normal, daily, multiple times daily. Probably too much for many of us, but just normal. Take joy in the normal is in a lot of ways the message. Take joy in the ordinary, because the ordinary is what God has assigned to us. And everything we must realize has been God-given, right? Repeated here over and over is that God has given us these. It's a gift of God. And it's grounded in God, that all of our joys and all of our ordinaries and all of our extraordinaries should be grounded in and rejoicing in the God who gave them to us. Now, the passage I want to finish looking at today is chapter 3, verse 9 through 15. Okay, Ecclesiastes 3. 9 through 15. If you got your Bibles, you can open there with me. It says this: "What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out the end, or find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away." 3 things, quickly. Number 1, it says God has ordered things beautifully. God has ordered things beautifully. Verse 10, "I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time." Now, this is probably not referring to God making things like intrinsically beautiful, like pretty, because it doesn't really fit the context. What he's probably saying here, indeed, is that God has ordered things elegantly. God has ordered things beautifully. God has orchestrated the universe perfectly. He has ordered things beautifully. Okay, second, God has ordered things so that we look to him. Verse 11, God has ordered things so that we look to him. says, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. He has put eternity in man's heart, yet we cannot find out. We strive to, but cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. The way he has ordered things, the way he's set things up, why things are happening the way that they're happening, right? The idea is we as humans strive to discover the almanac that would allow us to predict and control the times, right? That Back to the Future almanac. We want to find it that tells us what's going to happen so that we understand why things happen the way they did and why things will happen the way they will in the future. And the message is God has given us a sense of this great story, right? This great time, this eternity, this purpose of it all, this transcendent sense, which we don't fully understand of the things that are going on, that no other animal has, right? We have this sense of the progression of time. It's interesting that we have been given this awareness and curiosity about why things happened and how things happen and why they'll happen in the future and how they'll happen. And we've been given this sense that other animals have not been given, right? Other animals don't think about the animals that existed before them, right? Or the ones that will come after them, or the foundations of the world, or the meaning and purpose of it all. They don't think about the great story the way that we do. We have that awareness. And yet, this awareness is only enough to let us know that we don't understand it, right? It's only enough to let us know that we are powerless over it. God has placed this awareness in our hearts so that we will look to him, so that we will glorify him, so we'll rest in him, the only one who understands it and the only one who has control over it. Right? It's like one of those classic rom-com movie lines where the guy or the girl looks at her or him and says, I was perfectly happy before you in my misery, unaware that I was miserable, but now I'm miserable without you. Something like that. We are like that. The animals are perfectly contented and happy, not thinking about the great story, the reasons for it all, the way that we are. But we are aware of those things, and we think about those things. And so we look to the Creator now for joy and for answers in a way that the animals do not. Finally, joy is found by resting in God's order. Joy is found by resting in God's order. That God and not human beings controls the times is a fundamental teaching of the Bible. Israel's entire history, right? The story of the Old Testament in the Bible does not focus on the great armies or the great heroes or the great political military forces that shaped its direction. It's a story about God moving this nation forward. The God who is at all times progressing things and moving them forward to their intended goal. So that human beings may scheme and plot and try to make things happen the way that we want them to happen, but God is the one who has final say-so. God is the one who's controlling things. That's the story of the Bible. Right? We see this in the Old Testament throughout the story of Israel, maybe chiefly with the great kings of Babylon, where Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar think they're really something and think they have control. And David shows them both in their very unique ways in his quote, "It is God who gives kingdoms to whoever he wishes." Look, you're a king because God wanted you to be, because God gave it to you. You're not anything on your own. We see it just as much in the New Testament, where Jesus is telling us exactly what's going to happen, tells us exactly what's going to go down, and then pushes those things forward precisely because of that plan and that order that God has laid out. The only rational response to God's sovereignty is to revere God, to live a life centered on God, acknowledging that he's the creator, that he's the one in control. He is the one whose work is ultimate. He is the one whose work is always effective. He is the one who's ordering things, not you. And so a life that is not lived centered around him is futile, is meaningless, is vanity. Scholar Ian Provan, who's considered to have written one of the best commentaries in the book of Ecclesiastes, says this about this passage. He says, "It is indeed the appropriate response to the reality of the times, to the reality that the times are beyond our control. It is indeed the appropriate response to the reality that the times are beyond our control, but lie in the hands of God, that we should cease to worry so much about how things are going to work out and concentrate on living joyfully in the moment that's currently given to us." That's beautiful, isn't it? That the proper response to this reality that God's in control of the times and that we are not, the proper response is that we should cease to worry overly much about how things are going to work out and concentrate instead on living joyfully in the moment that's currently given to us. This moment, now, as you watch this moment is a gift given to you. Rest joyfully in this moment. The message is almost a Christianized carpe diem. Right? Carpe diem means seize the day, right? And when we say seize the day here, what we mean is seize the day because you're going to cease to exist one day, and you might as well do what you can while you're here, right? But this is a carpe diem. This is a seize the day that's centered on God and not on us, right? This version of carpe diem, this version of seize the day, is a realization that daily life comes to us as a gift from God, that your momentary breath, that this moment now comes to you as a gift from God, and we should patiently and joyfully embrace it as that gift. Far too often in our history, Christians have given this idea to the world that the Christian life is basically an ascetic one, right? Or one of minimizing all pleasure, minimizing all joy, minimizing all happiness while you're here, and it's just about beating yourself so that you can one day get heaven, right? To repress life now in order to gain life in the future. But that was never the message. That was never the message of the Creator God who created a garden for his people. The Christian message is that life is a gift both now and in eternity. The Christian life, thus, has been defined by many in America as focusing on the things in which we may not engage, which the things we cannot do, rather than in the glorious joy and freedom that is the inheritance of God's children both now and forevermore. Right? Biblical religion speaks of a God who made the world beautiful and made the world fruitful to be enjoyed by his creatures. A God who says, you are free to eat from any tree of the garden, with but one exception. And we focus on the exception rather than the massive gift and garden and freedom that he has given us. We are, of course, called by Jesus to deny ourselves and take up our cross daily. But that's a call to take yourself out of the center of your universe. It's a call to displace yourself from the place of worship. That's a message that Ecclesiastes has as well. It's not a call for misery in the garden, in this beautiful gift of a world that God has given us. Whatever we do as Christians, including not doing some things and doing other things, should be done out of joyful response to the God of extravagant blessing and grace as we live the abundant life that starts now and stretches all the way into eternity. Provan says this, only when what is done under the sun takes account of and responds to what is done by God can it be anything other than pointless. Only when what is done under the sun takes account of and responds to what is done by God can it be anything other than pointless. I love you, church. On Sunday, we're going to sing, after this message, we're going to sing a song that's incredibly appropriate to this. And I want you to think about these lyrics, and you can sing them yourself if you want. But that this is a life given to us by God and should be welcomed with joy. Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in the song with sweet accord. Join in the song with sweet accord, and thus surround the throne. Come we who love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Love you, church. Talk to you soon.